Guys, I have come on at the very beginning of this, before I actually start telling the story, to say to you, this is one of the most graphic cases that I've ever covered because there's public access to the records. I'm going to include tapes. I'm going to have the torturer talking to you directly because the recordings are there. I'm going to have images of sexual graphic toys that were used. And if you are somebody triggered by sexual abuse, please don't watch. It isn't worth it. For somebody like me who has a very strong stomach, I will tell you that I listened to the tapes and then had quite a few nightmares. So I want you to be aware of that. I know we love true crime. I know that a lot of us enjoy understanding the psychology of what makes a killer and what makes a rapist and so on and so forth. But you've always got to come from a place of self-protection. If you're triggered by any of that, please, this is not for you. And if you need to test that out before you watch this, just go and Google the Toybox killer and have a kind of read about some of the stuff that went on. And that will give you an idea as to whether you do want to watch it. But trigger warning, it is very, very graphic. Hi and welcome to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. I release content on a Wednesday and on a Sunday, so if you want to keep up with me, hit that subscribe button. Just hit it anyway. It's not going to do you any harm, is it? And you'll get a little knock on the door saying, I've released some new content and I'm very consistent. If you like true crime, hopefully I'll be able to talk about the psychology along with the victim experience and bring together both the hideousness of what occurs with the reality of justice. I like justice. Today's case is one I hadn't heard of. So again, you guys told me about it and it shocked me to the core because I think I know quite a lot about crime, serial killing, but often I've missed particular individuals who seem to surpass and supersede the killers that I believe are the most heinous in the world. So today, I'm going to be introducing you to the Toybox killer. And I hope that in spite of the fact of other people covering it and documentaries being done about it, that I will still be able to introduce you to some insights that you were not necessarily aware of. I have dug deep to cover this case. Let's take you back right to the very beginning, where essentially the case starts to unfold. It's on March the 22nd, 1999. The police in Elephant Butte, New Mexico, received numerous reports, basically, of a woman running down the streets in a hysterical state, completely naked. She's running down a dirt road, she's screaming, she's covered in blood, and one of the things that people are reporting is she seems to have some kind of collar on her. Those reports were absolutely correct. There was indeed a woman running down a dirt road, covered in blood, and actually what she had was a metal slave collar. So in BDSM, where people are involved in sadomasochism and bondage, collars are things that people will wear if they have a master or a mistress. They'll be a submissive. So essentially it's a sexual fetish, and this individual is seen with one around her neck, obviously hysterical. That woman was Cynthia Jaramillo. She was 22 years old and she was a prostitute, she was a working girl. And at that moment in time, the sight that people were seeing when she was desperately trying to flag down a car was a woman who literally was running for her life. It's as simple as that. She really was. This is where something that no one could have ever expected to unfold begins to. It's shocking. I can tell you, when I was researching this, I spent half of the time with my mouth open because It's the knowledge that this human being had been doing what he had been doing, with others as well, for a very long time. And what did that mean about the number of victims? And as I tell you about this story, you'll start to understand the gravity of this individual's depravity. So when they start this investigation, it basically leads them pretty quickly to a guy called David Parker Ray. And it also leads him to his Toybox that's on Bass Road. It's a soundproof trailer, but it's been transformed into an S&M sex and torture dungeon. And as you'll see in the pictures, it's terrifying. Now, I am the first person to acknowledge that people have fetishes and kink is part of that. And whatever your kink is, as long as it's consenting adults, then you knock yourself out. If you like a bit of masochism, fine. You like being a master and inflicting pain on a willing partner, not a problem. If you want to collect a range of dildos, instruments and chains and whips and whatever else you fancy to use to your heart's content on one another, knock yourself out. But that's where the story ends, because that S&M sex and torture dungeon wasn't a consensual one. What you're seeing in those pictures is a place that has been designed to torture and likely kill many women, totally innocent women. And Cynthia Jaramillo, that 22-year-old working girl, had found herself in that horrific place. But before we get to the story itself of the horrific torture that took place there, let's talk about Parker Ray. So he's born in New Mexico, November 1939, and he had a sister, Peggy. They were basically raised by their grandparents, their father's parents. They were first-generation ranchers, pretty strict people. So Parker Ray's and Peggy's father, Cecil, actually divorced their mother. She was called Nettie, and he took the custody of both their children. I think he did that probably to wound Nettie. I think that he wanted control and power. I think you'll see that he had a very domineering personality. And as soon as he got custody of the children, he basically dumped them on his parents. So we were also at this moment starting to see that on a potential DNA level, there are control issues, certainly in the male line, shall we say. Now, Parker Ray's grandfather was a classic older generation grandparent. And in this case, he was an acting guardian, so he was an acting parent to some degree. He was a very strict disciplinarian. He was also a fundamentalist. His rules in his home were all that mattered. Now, if those rules were not followed, there were very clear physical punishments. You know, he's not the cuddly, affectionate, bearded grandfather that you want to go and hang out with in the allotment. He's more the, I will whoop your ass kind of guy. And that's hard for any kid, right? No child wants to be beaten. It's the weirdest thing in the world when adults hit children. Why? It's such an unequal situation. An adult is always in control. They don't need to be violent. And that might be my personal bias, but it exists for good reason. I see the results of what abuse does. I see the result of what attachment disorder does. I see the result of children being manhandled. And certainly when you're growing up in a disciplinary environment where you feel scared of the person who's going to take care of you, it can lead to a whole heap of problems. So Parker Ray's mother wasn't on the scene. As we know, his father got custody of the children and she disappeared. His dad was also alcoholic, not ideal, so he also would be in his life, but only from time to time. You know, he'd occasionally come. Those visits were not the brilliant, Dad's going to take us bowling. They were horrible. Those visits were not something that Parker Ray looked forward to at all. He was a violent drunk, and from a very early age, one of the things that his father would do was that he would bring him S&M magazines to look at. I mean, that's the kind of role model you want, isn't it? Oh, great, Sunday with Dad. What should we do? Well, here, son, have some violent pornography. When you are being formed by people in your world, particularly primary caregivers who may be poor role models, but nonetheless, they are your role model to some degree, the influence that that kind of information can have can be catastrophic. And this is certainly where we start to see an activation in Parker Ray's predilections sexually. If it could not get worse with this picture-perfect parent, one of the other things that he allegedly taught Parker Ray to do was to kill animals and then to have sex with them. Now, I'm all for teaching your children about the birds and the bees. You know, have open and honest conversations with them about sexual relationships. But the idea that that man would come to an already dysfunctional situation and teach his own child to have sex with animals after killing them, it beggars belief. And we're also introduced to the traumatization of a child, because it might be that Parker Ray starts to have a predilection for these feelings. Think about it. One of the ways is to be fully traumatized, to feel you have no sense of control over your environment and to hate everything that's happening. One is to feel traumatized but buy into the situation so that you can adopt some kind of relationship with a parent and act out these particular situations that seem to get you some kind of validation, sexually gratifying, and also from the parent that is dysfunctional, but also that you crave attention from. So you can see that either way, this is traumatization. But this is not what we would expect a father to be doing to a child. And it's molestation. It doesn't matter that the father might not be touching Parker Ray. The fact that he is sexualizing him in this way is child molestation. So confusing, absolutely disgusting, and clearly a catalyst for the future heinous crimes that are committed, without a doubt. So we certainly begin allaying some kind of responsibility, both to the grandparents who were very violent, and secondly, undoubtedly, to the father who is deviant beyond belief. And we have to say that the mother has abandoned them. So there are a huge amount of issues going on right now. When he went to school, Parker Ray was not popular. He was really shy, he was awkward, he was very introverted. The people who knew him said that particularly around girls he struggled. He got very badly teased, very badly bullied by his classmates. It was very difficult at certain points in time to grow up as a child from a broken home. Back in the day when he was growing up, it was far more likely that parents would stay together in terrible relationships, and they would do that so that their local community accepted them. If you didn't fit that paradigm, it could be really challenging. It's the same with illegitimate children. So growing up in a community where people know that your parent is a drunk and your mother has abandoned you, it's going to be troublesome. And children can be really mean, let's be honest about that. So the fact he's getting bullied and he doesn't have the social skills, it's going to start creating some rage within him. It goes one of two ways, doesn't it? We either turn it inwards to ourselves, we can harm ourselves, we can cause ourselves deep problems, or we can externalize it and take it out on other people. And it feels like this is where Parker Ray starts to harbour this deep resentment, particularly for women. Also note that he's got issues with his mum. And again, as we see with lots of serial killers, mummy issues are a big theme. I would say he wasn't known as a troublemaker, so it's not as if school were constantly telling his grandparents that he was a problem. It wasn't that he stood out to some degree in that way. It seems like his behaviour was relatively in check. However, of course, if you want to be a serial killer and rapist, you're going to know how to behave, aren't you, elsewhere? Because if you want to be able to get away with it, you need to know how to wear a mask. So even though he wasn't known to be a troublemaker, doesn't mean that he wasn't carrying all of these other deviant behaviours, such as mutilating animals and having sex with them. It can live and coexist in the same moment. You can be a very dangerous human and the nicest guy in the world to your friends. We see that constantly, don't we, play out, particularly with organised offenders. And let me tell you, my God, I have witnessed and studied organised offenders, organised serial killers. They are scary, because they are absolutely diligent and meticulous in the way that they carry out their crimes. I do not think I have come across one as diligent as Parker Ray. This man, from a really early age, was planning his crimes, refining how he was going to do it. And part of his fantasy play, probably as a child, was thinking in the far future about how he'd carry out his control, how he'd take back the control of an environment that had been dysfunctional and difficult for him, and how he was going to do that was through making women pay. As a teenager, he did abuse drugs and alcohol. Again, we can say from research, when you have an alcoholic in the family, you are more likely to have issues with alcohol yourself. So there is that pattern. But also there is the permission base, isn't there? If your parents have failed you in that way, and that's what they use, and you're also dealing with awkwardness, insecurity, and maybe you even want to be sexually more adventurous, then alcohol and drugs can really help you do that. Alcohol and drugs give you an opportunity to reduce your inhibitions, which can mean that, particularly sexually, you can engage in behaviours that you wouldn't feel that comfortable doing unless you were under that influence. So he's trying these kind of behaviours out. And one of the things that we know that's really unusual is that he developed a paraphilia, a fetish for broken bottles. And he'd actually keep those broken bottles in a hideaway that he'd built in the woods. Now we know, don't we, that some serial killers have that kind of MO. They have a grading of behaviour where they do things that the rest of the world would find very strange, but for them it's incredibly titillating, it's exciting, just for them. And those kind of trophies are obviously the beginning of him starting to think about what he could do with them, the sadomasochistic intentions that he was developing and harbouring. Now, by all accounts, it's agreed on that he was a really lonely boy, had a really unhappy life, clearly. As a child, what he was going through was pretty tortuous. And it seems like this growing fascination with S&M, this desire to control his environment, starts from a very, very early age, and it's also pretty much the only thing that gives him joy. Just the idea of taking a woman, torturing a woman, killing a woman. Where this hatred definitively comes from, we can only make guesses. But personally for me, I think it comes initially from his abandonment by his mother. When you feel that your primary caregiver has rejected you, that is a difficult cross to bear. And if you believe that your worthiness has been questioned, then it can be completely disabling and debilitating to carry that with you. So if you reject that by creating a rage and a hatred towards women, then you've no longer lost anything, because you've chosen to take on this belief system about them. Why would you want a mother if women are so terrible? Why would you have to respect a woman? Because you've recognised that you can reject that and abandon that belief system. And in doing so, you feel that you've got a level of control and more power. Also, we've got to acknowledge he was bullied at school. Maybe he looked at the girls and felt that they were unachievable. Maybe he felt that they bullied him and made him feel small. And he harboured that resentment and thought, one day you'll get what's coming to you. All of those things are possible, but Parker Ray is the only person who would ever be able to answer those questions. One thing that he was really good at from very early on was building. He was really quick at learning how to fix machinery, and if ever there was a skill set that was not a good mix, it's the fact that Parker Ray was good at building and fixing machinery, because man, that proved useful as he went further down the line in the commission of some of the most heinous crimes I think that anybody could be responsible for. When it came down to work, obviously he's building his repertoire at knowing how to use machinery, and he does go into the US Army and only is there for a short time. And after that, obviously, he's really good with his hands. He becomes a maintenance man for the New Mexico Parks Department. He's really well liked at work as well, just let that be known. He's considered a really excellent member of staff. He also, at that point, thought, you know what? Something's missing in my life. Need a bit of connection. Church might be good. Good people at church, things to do, people to meet. Yeah, I'll join the Church of Satan. Brilliant. So now we have a man with this incredibly dark predilection who likes the idea of sadomasochism, certainly is harbouring ideas about torturing, raping and murdering women, and enjoys the fact that they're fantasising about that. And now he's become a Satanist. So he sounds like a really well-adjusted kind of human being that you'd want to hang out with. So Parker Ray's got this really unsettled youth. He marries on multiple occasions, has a couple of kids, but he never manages to actually settle down that effectively. He does spend a few years on the road basically going through a hippie lifestyle, which I imagine would have been full of sex, drugs and rock and roll. So again, that permission base, he's having the opportunity to kind of live out his fantasies probably. Everything was so much more loose during that time. There was a lot more liberalism, a lot more acceptance of, shall we say, kinks that might not be validated in small country towns where he came from. But he does return home to the same area that he was brought up, and then he meets his third wife. And he has about a decade where he's living with the facade of being a family man. Now, we all know is not a family man. He coexists as this mask. He's acting appropriately in front of certain people doing certain things, but there is this whole lifestyle behind him, you know, going on in his mind, going on in his private life, because we know that that facade was something that was very brittle. He's indulging in his love of S&M constantly with prostitutes, and he's probably at this point already torturing and murdering women. And I say probably because the thing about this organised offender is he's so organised that bodies are a problem to find. Meticulous, like I said, diligent, very careful, very good with his hands. So now you've got a background of who created Parker Ray, how he was brought up, what led to a point where we can start understanding where some of these predilections have come from. So let's come back to the moment. We've got Cynthia, working girl, and her bloody, unbelievably incredible escape. And I've watched documentaries on this to figure things out and understand from different points of view, but honestly, I didn't find any of the information that I'm going to share with you in those. I just dug deep into the paperwork and the responses and reports, because you just don't get the feel of what she managed to achieve in so many of the conversations around what happened. It's stunning. And without her doing this, I don't think he would ever have been stopped. So she'd been working as a prostitute near her home in Albuquerque, and it's that point where she's first approached by Parker Ray. He offers her $20 for oral sex. So she goes back to his RV, and waiting there at Parker Ray's RV is his girlfriend, Cindy Lee Hendy. So after Parker Ray's fourth marriage, he's very good at this marriage, he's good at getting them, just not keeping them. After this fourth marriage is ended in divorce, he meets Cindy. Now, she works at Elephant Butte State Park, and they had just connected. Why? I'll give you a guess. It may be in the fact that she too enjoys raping women. That is very unusual. Okay, I know that women are imperfect, they murder, they kill, they child molest, I appreciate it. It is still very unusual for women to enjoy raping other women. It is still predominantly, majorly, a male to female crime. Part of that is the way that we are brought up, to be more nurturing. Even if we have those predilections, we have more of a moral compass because we are told how we are meant to behave. He manages to find that perfect partner in crime, that Myra to Ian Brady, that Rose to Fred West. It's very unusual, particularly in a small area. But remember, he's in the Church of Satan. So he's probably managed to whittle the pool of possibility down, and she has stood out for him. So it's at this point that Parker Ray produces a police badge and advises Cynthia that basically she's under arrest for solicitation. You know, as a prostitute, this is going to be something that happens. The police do arrest you, you go in, you get fined, you might do a few days in, whatever. It won't be something that's unusual to her. And you also know as a prostitute that even though you're a woman with rights, behaving is the best way to deal with this. So if you're going to show me a police badge and I'm going to believe that you are arresting me for solicitation, I'm going to go quietly. Why? Because I don't want any more problems when you're processing me down at the station. At the point where he begins to gag and cuff her, she realises instinctually she's been through this. This is not a police sting. This is a kidnapping. Makes my stomach lurch thinking about that. Just the way that they managed to manipulate that situation so that this woman who thinks she's going to turn a trick suddenly realises that she's being arrested, and then even worse, she realises this isn't an arrest, this is a complete ruse. She's being taken. She's left helpless in the back of the vehicle whilst Parker Ray and Cindy drive for several hours. So they have gone trawling a long way out of their way. So again, what does that tell you? This isn't something that they've just done. They know how to find territories where people won't automatically assume or implicate them. If you're several hours away and people don't know who you are and you're going to solicit prostitutes, it's going to be far easier to get them within your power. So this is a tried and tested routine without a doubt. So when they finally get to their destination, she's 150 miles away from her home. She's in Elephant Butte with Cindy and Parker Ray, literally a town that she has no idea of. In fact, there's only around 1,300 people in that place, and it is one of those places that's in the middle of nowhere. Nowhere to run, nowhere to escape, really. Completely lost, completely isolated. How would you cope with that psychologically? How would you be able to just sit in that moment and think to yourself, how am I going to make this through? Because you know, if they've picked you up off the street, faked you into an arrest, gagged you, taken you hundreds of miles away, you know it's not going to end well. And what happened next, it's worse than pretty much any horror movie I've ever seen. And like most of you who watch crime, we like our horror, right? But it's just like it's been taken out of a horror film. If somebody had written this script, I feel personally that you wouldn't have made it as scary. That's how awful it is. She's taken into the back of a 25-foot long windowless trailer, Parker Ray's Toybox. And at that point, she's chained to a post. So this is where the humiliation begins. This is where a victim becomes aware that firstly, there is no escape, and secondly, that they have to submit to the desires of those in charge if they want to survive. And potentially they don't even know whether they're going to survive. So if she was wondering at this moment in terror what's going to happen to her, she wasn't going to have to wait long to find out. And I'll tell you why. Because Parker Ray, as I said, highly organised offender, well, he had a tape recording that starts playing to tell her exactly what is going to happen to her. Basically, the terrifying truth of a situation is going to be revealed in all its horror. And I'm going to let you listen to the beginning of that now.
Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal under the circumstances. For a little while, at least, you need to get your shit together and listen to this tape. It is very relevant to your situation. I'm going to tell you, in detail, why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you, and how long you'll be here. I don't know the details of your capture because this tape is being created July 23rd, 1993, as a general advisory tape for future female captives. The information I'm going to give you is based on my experience dealing with captives over a period of several years. If, at a future date, there are any major changes in our procedures, the tape will be upgraded. Now, you are obviously here against your will. Totally helpless. Don't know where you're at. Don't know what's going to happen to you. You're very scared or very pissed off. I'm sure that you've already tried to get your wrists and ankles loose. No, you can't. Now you're just waiting to see what's going to happen next. You probably think you're going to be raped, and you're fucking sure right about that.
I'm sure after listening to that, it's taken you by surprise that there could be somebody so premeditated, so enjoying that moment of playing that tape. Because that's what he's done whilst enjoying the experience. He's recorded that, he's written that script. That's not off the bat. He's created that. He's probably recorded it a few times to get it just right. He's probably played it titillatingly to his sexual partner. They've probably got off on that. That's how premeditated and planned this is. There are various tapes that Parker Ray made and played to his captives at various times, and I have to be honest with you, some of the parts are utterly horrific. It's horrific per se. There is not one part of this which is okay. It's not like halfway through it gets to a good nice bit where you can have a massage and a spa. It's horrific per se. But the more degrading he can make it, you can tell the happier he feels. And some parts of the tape involve the promise that they're going to be subjected to really degrading sexual acts including bestiality. Again, I could say it, but I'm going to let him say it for you.
I'm going to rub canine breeder's musk on your back, the back of your neck, and on your sex organs. Now I have 3 dogs. All of them's male, because I don't need any fucking pups. One of them is a very large German Shepherd that is always horny, and he loves it when I bring him in the house to fuck a woman. After I let him in the house, he'll sniff around you a little bit, and within a minute, he'll be mounting you. There's about a 50-50 chance which hole he'll get his penis into, but it doesn't seem to bother him whether it's the pussy or the asshole. His penis is pretty thin. It goes in easy, but it's about 10 inches long, and when he gets completely excited, it gets a hell of a knot right in the middle of it. Now, I've had slaves tell me that it feels like they got a baseball inside of them.
Have you ever heard something so depraved? This isn't the stuff of fantasies. This is real. This happened. Women had to experience what he's talking about. It doesn't matter whether that's a prostitute, that's a woman, potential mother, partner, friend, daughter, and they were subjected to that kind of horror, that kind of terror. For me, it's traumatizing listening to it. I can't even imagine what it would have been like being Cynthia and just hearing it. She later told the police how Parker Ray treated her like a dog. He used to make her eat off the floor, used to bathe her like a dog. On one occasion, Parker Ray, I'm going to say this, I feel like all the way through this has got to be like trigger warnings because it's just horrific. But he forcefully inserted gravy into her vagina while she was restrained so that his dogs could remove it against her will. Again, this is planned, premeditated fantasy. These are not things that are spur of the moment. He has been doing this a long time by the time we get to Cynthia. He's learnt to build up his repertoire of needs. You don't start at that level subjecting somebody to such humiliation, agony, torture, right? You don't. You start right at the beginning. To get to a place where you need to be doing that to find yourself sexually satisfied, you have been through probably thousands of situations. So that's what makes Parker Ray so terrifying. Because he's clearly been kidnapping, torturing, and raping young women for years. And he wants to make it really clear to every single victim who ends up in that tortuous toy box exactly what they're going to expect. So he says they're going to be restrained for the entirety of their imprisonment, and it will be however he likes. So it might be with their legs spread, it might be in a certain position. They'll also have 24-hour monitoring. So they'll have videos everywhere, meaning that he can keep watching them. It just enables them to feel even more powerless because this guy is very dangerous. And if I'm going to try to escape, then I'm going to feel his wrath. And now I know that he's watching me 24/7. He wouldn't even need to be. It would be enough for me to believe it. That's where the power lies. The power is in the perception of the victim. And the perception of the victim would be, Jesus, I've got to do exactly what he says. He tells them that they're going to be raped multiple times per day by him, sometimes with his friends, so other people. And also, they would have to satisfy his girlfriend, Cindy. And he's very specific about that. Very specific about how hard it's going to be for them to sustain the needs that they have. A particular liking of Parker Ray was to use dildos. And as he'll describe here, you can feel the connection that he has with knowing the pain that they're going to cause, the humiliation that they're going to create, and the power that he has because he can do this.
The dildos are going to be used a lot, more than anything else, and consequently what you're going to have the most trouble with. Many of them are very long, very large in diameter, and very painful when they're being forced in. Your mistress will use them in your pussy, and I like to use them in both holes.
So whilst being held prisoner in that toy box, Parker Ray's victims were expected to be really subservient and show complete respect to him and his partner Cindy. So that means in BDSM, when you have a submissive, remember, a submissive is always consensual. You want a master, you look for a master, you enjoy it. And part of that is that you refer to them as master or mistress. But that's in a consensual relationship. But he has his kidnapped victims be that way. They have to start their sentences with master or mistress. And he has a particular enjoyment when you call him dungeon master. If you follow the rules, it won't be as bad as it could be. But if you fail to follow the rules, you're going to find yourself being punished in so many ways. He would whip people, he would give them electric shocks. I'll let him describe some of the other things that he'd do.
Because each time you fuck up, I'm going to press a little button and send a few thousand volts of electricity through your nipples, right down into your tits. You are in training, so it will just be a quick blast. I'm not going to hold it down and torture you. But each time you screw up, it's going to be a little bit worse.
Now, I don't think that Parker Ray killed all of his victims, because the tapes do explain that once he's finished with them, their bodies are going to be thoroughly cleaned, remove any DNA evidence. They'll then be drugged with a cocktail of drugs, which are basically going to confuse them, create a state of amnesia. That's something that he enjoys. Just listen to what he says.
I get off on mind games. After we get completely through with you, you're going to be drugged up real heavy with a combination of sodium pentothal and phenobarbital. They are both hypnotic drugs that will make you extremely susceptible to hypnosis, auto-hypnosis, and hypnotic suggestion. You're going to be kept drugged a couple days while I play with your mind. By the time I get through brainwashing you, you're not going to remember a fucking thing about this little adventure.
Just think about that. He has studied mind control drugs. He understands medically how to not just induce confusion, but how to induce amnesia. That is something that he has really taken note of. And he's got access to that stuff as well. What does that say about the people that he knows? You see, when I see something so constructed, when I know that they're involved in Satanism, when they've got away with doing these things for a very long time, who else is supporting them? How does he get those kind of supplies? And arguably, there'll always be black market, right? But I always think that people in powerful positions sometimes like certain things that if we found out, they would be in serious trouble. And they gravitate themselves towards people who can provide certain services. And it seems to me that Parker Ray certainly provided those services. And I wouldn't be surprised if he was provided with those supplies by people in the know, such as medics. When Cynthia actually tells the police that she's been held captive and basically tortured horrifically by Parker Ray and his girlfriend for days on end, and remember, by this point, she's been repeatedly raped, she's been humiliated with a variety of sex toys, medical instruments, and she's had electric shock machine treatment. You know, she's also been told that she's going to be taken to another secure room where Parker Ray would up the ante and give her even more degrading acts. So she's been constantly aware that these kind of situations aren't going anywhere. More and more, he's going to get this gratification from these horrific acts that he's going to subject her to. So Cynthia's a clever girl. You know, she's been around. Working the streets is hard work. And it teaches you to be quick on your feet, and it teaches you to know when there is a serious chance that you're in absolute danger. And at this point, I think she knows that if she doesn't get away, there's a strong likelihood she's not going to be ever getting away. That either she could be kept there for months and months and months, or murdered. So the minute that there is an opportunity where she can escape, my God, she's looking for it. Even though she's been told that she's going to be watched 24/7. Even though she's constantly aware that they are going to do whatever they want to do with her and that she's in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles away from where she's going to be, she's clever and she's watching. And basically, the moment that she gets to escape, it presents itself this way. She's chained to the pole, she's in the trailer, she's got the metal collar around her neck, and she's aware of the routine. Parker Ray leaves for work, because obviously he's working all the way through this. He's a good worker. He's thought of as very, very good in the industry that he works in. Incredibly good with his hands, incredibly good with machinery. Yes, I think we know that. She then notices that a mistake's been made. A bunch of keys have been left near to her, and they include the key to the slave collar. Can you imagine how she'd be feeling? The adrenaline that would be going through her body. That moment where she's thinking, oh my God, this is it. I might be able to escape. So once Parker Ray's left, she gets the keys, she unlocks the padlock, she grabs a nearby phone, she calls 911. Now, at this moment, your heart's racing, right? Because we're like, oh my God, thank God for that. Like, she's done it. She's in that situation where she's going to escape. And then like something out of some horrific horror movie, Cindy re-enters the trailer, catches her in the act. Now remember, Cindy is somebody who's been involved in this crime for a long period of time. She's definitely been involved in BDSM. She's got the perfect partner in Parker Ray, and she will know how to control a girl who's, shall we say, getting a little bit resistant. So she comes in, they start having a fight, and at this point, Cindy strikes Cynthia over the head with a table lamp, disconnects the call to the police, but again, remember where she is. She is in a torture chamber. Take your pick, sweetheart, because there's a hell of a lot around that you can use to make sure that you fight back. Oh, and she does. She gets an ice pick that's been knocked to the floor, and she stabs Cindy in the neck. So at this point, Cindy knows that she's met her match, number one, and number two, she's injured. The fact that she's not mortally injured, she won't be processing. All she knows is she's been stabbed. And when we get into a situation where we're attacked in that way, we tend to take a moment to kind of recognise how bad is it before we act again. So she backs away, and that's it. Cynthia is out of the door, naked, blood pouring down her face from the wound to her head, running. Obviously convinced at that point that any moment in time, her captors are going to be in close pursuit. And also, she's going to know that, my God, if they catch me, they're going to kill me. He's already told her what happens if she misbehaves at all. Now she's damaged the mistress, the woman in charge of her. I mean, that is an absolute suicide mission. You just can't do that because you're the submissive. And also, now she's got out. And so for her, the idea is that any moment now, they're going to catch her. She's desperately trying to flag down cars. She would be, wouldn't she? And what are they going to be thinking? I mean, think about it. Driving down the road in an area that's quite rural, and the next minute you see a naked woman covered in blood, massive collar on, running down the road, screaming hysterically. It's not something that the average human being can process. And so a lot of them just pass her by. It's not that they don't call the police, it's that they are too scared. She's hysterical, covered in blood, cuts and bruises, and they don't know how she's ended up that way. A lot of people make terrible assumptions in those circumstances, like why was she chained up? Is she a dangerous person that needs to be chained up? You can see how the brain would be working to self-protect, so they don't stop. But thank God, salvation comes. She basically comes across a trailer home. It's got the front door unlocked. The minute she bursts in, she's screaming her head off, and the owner is there. Total shock, but the owner doesn't deny her. Takes her in. She's called Darlene Breach, the woman. She gets Cynthia a robe, she covers her up, and then she allows the young woman to speak to the police. So she helps her do that. Actually, what's amazing is they were already on the way, because that phone call that had gone through to the police and got cut off, they were checking because they felt like there was a struggle. So it's brilliant. They're on their way anyway. My God, they were not prepared for what they found. But what we do know is that Cynthia's life was saved that day because of her quick intelligence, her streetwise behaviour, and her willingness not to be anybody's slave. Let's give it to Cynthia. That's the reality. All the way through that, she was plotting how she was going to get away, and she absolutely saved other people's lives because of that. When the police officers actually get to meet Cynthia, obviously they're very sceptical. They're thinking to themselves, what? She's been held for 3 days as a sex slave in some kind of S&M's torture room. And they probably thought to themselves, this is a working girl, she's likely got herself into some trouble, and she might be high, because obviously drugs and alcohol are a part of that lifestyle at times. And I would imagine that they are questioning her more than they would do if she wasn't a prostitute. Nonetheless, people have reported that they've seen a naked woman screaming. She's obviously told her story to the police, so they get a warrant. And that's when they search Parker Ray's land, and they are horrified. The RV is approximately 15 by 25 feet. It's kitted out with every instrument of torture, every sexual device you could even begin to imagine. There are things there you wouldn't be able to imagine. It just won't be your kink. Certainly when I look at the list, it's shocking. And when I look at the things that he's made himself, it's even more terrifying. He had cattle prods, shock sticks, giant dildos, whips, pulleys, chains adorned to the walls of the trailer. There was even a fur-lined coffin-sized box that Parker Ray would regularly put his victims in. That's the ultimate, isn't it? Get in the coffin. It's just playing with that psychology, isn't it? Letting them know that he holds the power of life or death over them. Truly, truly controlling and terrifying. You know, the whole place, every single bit of it, every tiny bit of it, every inch of it was designed to imprison and torture his sex slaves. And they were kept there permanently. Imagine how uncomfortable that was. They're restrained during their entire time in the toy box. It might be that they were suspended on pulleys and chains. They might be strapped to some devices. He used to have this thing about spreading a woman's legs as far apart as possible because he wanted to ensure maximum discomfort for them and also easy access for what he wanted to do to them. Terrifyingly enough, there was also, and this is what I'm saying about where he got the medication from, because there was a gynecological table with a mirror fixed above it. I think that he had lots of visitors come to that place, some of whom the local community probably trusted with their health. But Parker Ray really enjoyed his victims to see what he was doing to them. So that was one of the reasons that he did it. Locally, no one could believe it. Absolutely no one believed that Parker Ray was capable of any kind of foul play. You know, he's described as polite, held a full-time job, no criminal record, well-respected because he was an amazing mechanic, obviously had a lot of practice building whatever he fancied. But it was those skills that allowed him to construct these bespoke toys in this torture chamber and so many of the implements that he had within it. Now, despite the overwhelming evidence police had in this trailer, its contents and the first-hand account from Cynthia, they actually still had to prove that Cynthia had been an unwilling victim. See, think about that. She's a working girl. Okay, he's got this unbelievable array of toys and this really odd constructed seeming torture chamber, but couldn't that just be something that him and his partner use for kink? They hire in a girl, have some fun, she gets paid, they go by. That's obviously going to be something that the police are considering. Fortunately, and again, my stomach flips because I'm like, this could have just gone the other way. Fortunately, they do discover a videotape, and that videotape, its contents have got another woman in the situation that basically Cynthia has described herself being in. So they see the similar abuse, and they can tell that it's not a willing participant. So what's amazing about this is that police were actually able to find the woman who was in the video. She's called Kelly Garrett. Her mother-in-law saw coverage of the case, contacted the police, because one of the things that had happened is her daughter-in-law had gone missing for several days. Just disappeared. Turns up, dishevelled, confused, quite badly injured and unconscious on the side of the road. So her mother-in-law's sitting there going, Jesus, that's what happened. That's how my daughter-in-law ended up like that. And she had actually tried to express what had happened to her. She tried to recall it, but she just couldn't firmly connect, because obviously she was so highly drugged. Problem is that people didn't believe her. They'd assumed that she'd just been unfaithful, got high, and actually the consequence of that was they asked her to leave. So this poor woman who has been brutally attacked, kidnapped, horribly tortured, then drugged to a point where she's confused and can't remember what's happened, she gets doubly punished because they reject her. But in truth, after having had this horrible way with her, Parker Ray's driven her to a remote location, slashed her throat, just left her to die. Now, she survived, just some stroke of luck that she survived. She'd been massively drugged, but even though that had happened, she was able to corroborate the details that Cynthia was coming up with. She was actually able to say to the police, yeah, these kind of things happened to me. So even though she had this confusion, once it starts to be described and she starts to be able to connect with those memories, they start coming forward. And this is mind-blowing. The other thing that she confirms is it's Parker Ray's daughter, Glenda Jean. She's called Jessie Ray. She is who drugged her. Drugged her at a local bar, took her to Parker Ray's trailer and helped restrain her. Like father, like daughter. Like father, like daughter. Imagine the fact that he's managed to get to a point where he's involving his own child in that kind of BDSM, as his own father did to him. So carrying on that family line. Horrifying, right? And the fact that he's using his own daughter to go and do that, to coerce, to get people to trust her so that she can bring back his play toys. Now, at the time, there was bloody loads of press interest. I mean, it was a huge story, wasn't it? Now, shortly after this story broke, obviously now it's getting notoriety, and another woman comes forward named Angelica, and she said that she was abducted, raped and tortured by Parker Ray and Cindy after she'd called round at their house to borrow cake mix. Can you believe the gravity of these crimes? She goes round to borrow some cake mix and ends up in a torture chamber. Several days of captivity. She recalled horrible sex acts, lots of degrading experiences, but she does manage at this point to get them to release her. So they drive her to a remote area of the desert and they dump her there. How she managed to do that, I've no idea. We do know that he didn't kill all of his victims. Obviously, there are survivors, but there must have been something that she managed to connect with in both of them psychologically that made them feel that she was safe to do that. Or maybe he just was so arrogant that he believed that he could drug her to a point where she wouldn't remember. He's very arrogant. So when she manages to get to the police assistance, she reports what's happened to her. Police are like, okay, yeah, not going to do anything about that. Took no action. Now, this is a woman who went to borrow cake mix. She didn't just turn up as a hitchhiker, having no ability to recall who had done this to her. She went to their house. It was a local person. And they didn't take any further action. It could have ended there. But because of this, other women were harmed, probably killed. And once news of Cynthia's ordeal hits the headlines, Angelica's case is obviously reopened. And that, fortunately, allows the Parker Ray evidence to start building against him. Because suddenly we've got more than one witness. We've got people giving testimony. But it's shocking that these women, arguably, if they hadn't started to piece the picture together, could well have been a jigsaw puzzle that never got filled. Police obviously at this point are like, wow, we've got a serial rapist, probably a serial killer, and we didn't know that he was living in our midst. Cindy, Parker Ray's accomplice, Cindy was very, very cooperative with investigators because I'll tell you why. She was like, I could go down for a very long time. I think you should go down instead. She's looking for a plea deal, isn't she? She wants to reduce any sentence for the crimes that she's got involved in. So Cindy is an interesting case. She's moved to New Mexico because she's basically at risk of being prosecuted for various offences. They included things like drug possession and other misdemeanours, shall we say. She began a relationship with Parker Ray. He's 20 years older than her. Now, she claimed that Parker Ray had murdered as many as 14 of his victims. 14. They're the ones that she remembers when she was with him. He's been doing this a long time. She said that he dismembered the bodies, dumped them in various ravines around the local area, including Elephant Butte Lake. Horrific. She also implicated Parker Ray's daughter, Jessie Ray, and one of his friends, Dennis Roy Yancey, in the disappearance of a 22-year-old mum of two called Marie Parker. So when Yancey's taken in and questioned, he hasn't got a lot of staying power with the police. He is interrogated and he reveals pretty quickly what happened to Marie. So according to Yancey, Marie is one of his ex-girlfriends, whom Parker Ray and Cindy's abducted, raped and tortured for several days. Horrific. So allegedly, Parker Ray sent for Yancey, ordered him to strangle Marie with a rope, which he did, whilst Parker Ray took photos. He told police that he was just really scared of Parker Ray and that's why he did it. Now, I don't buy into that. At the end of the day, if you're willing to kill somebody because somebody requests you to, then you're a very dangerous human being who does not deserve to walk the planet in the way that we do. I do appreciate that he was probably aware that Parker Ray had murdered a lot of people and maybe thought he'd kill him. You still have a choice. You still have a choice. Now, he did try to take the police to the body because he knew where they'd dumped her, but they couldn't find her. And the reason for that, they believe, is because what Parker Ray would do after he'd killed them, he would often, if other people had been involved, go back and move the body parts purely to protect himself fully. Now, Yancey was ultimately found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. He was given a 30-year sentence, rightly so. Jessie Ray, Parker Ray's daughter, who I think is absolutely a hideous human being, she was ultimately found guilty of kidnapping, criminal sexual penetration, and she was sentenced to 30 months, which I think is appalling. I cannot believe she only got 30 months. As far as I'm concerned, she is as culpable as him because she was delivering people to him. I don't care how controlled she was. She had the opportunity to walk into any police station. She was a free person. I don't care how coerced she was. She knew what he was doing and she allowed that to happen. She even encouraged it by delivering people that he could then abuse. Now, Cindy, she assisted police straight away, was like, how do I get myself off this? And she got 5 counts of being an accessory and she was sentenced to 36 years. Still a long time, 36 years. So she was looking at a life sentence that meant that she would never get out. Parker Ray, this is unbelievable. Clearly, sexual sadist of the highest order. Now, more than 1/3 of people who've got this form of paraphilia, which is, paraphilia means sexual behaviour that's outside the norm, claim they discovered it well into adulthood. So let's just look at what a diagnosis of sexual sadism disorder is based on. So basically, it's a specific clinical criteria from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So patients have to basically be repeatedly and intensely aroused by the physical or psychological suffering of another person. And arousal is expressed in fantasies, intense urges, or behaviours. So patients also have to have acted on these urges, and that has to be with a non-consenting person, or these fantasies or urges have to cause significant distress or impair function at their work or in their social situations or in other important areas. So typically, sexual sadists enjoy the feeling of power. They like the authority that they've got over other human beings. They enjoy the physical infliction and psychological infliction of pain and humiliation. Some start off engaging in activities like being a submissive, and then they can build up from being a submissive to being more dominant. There are really extreme cases where sexual sadism can become criminal, because if you're looking for a non-consensual victim, obviously that can turn to serial rape, can turn to murderers. Think about the serial murderers out there, the ones who have a really high sexual motive for what they do. So Parker Ray is clearly a case in point, isn't he? The time, the money, the effort, all of that, working alone to transform a trailer into an S&M playground. It's just testament to this kind of connection and commitment. He was somebody very early on who was into S&M. He was someone who was developing his taste. Obviously, we understand probably through the way his parent was parenting him, but certainly he took that on full throttle. It's believed that he spent over $100,000 on his torture chamber. He was dedicated. And what's really sad about this is we'll never know how many people Parker Ray murdered. We don't know how many he raped, how many abducted. We believe that there is a possibility he might have started even as early as the 1950s when he was still a child. Who knows, maybe with his dad. Now, according to Parker Ray's diaries, because he was very detailed, this is what I'm saying about a really organised offender. This is what terrifies me about him. Because bet your bottom dollar, he's not the only one that existed. He's not the only one that exists. There'll be someone today meticulously taking notes on what they're doing to another human being. He noted what he did to all his victims. He may have abducted, murdered, and tortured more than 60. Maybe we should double that, though. You know, Parker Ray was married 4 times. Every single one of them ended in divorce. Allegedly, he told his first wife he was just a teenager when he kidnapped a woman. When he tied her to a tree, tortured, murdered her. It was never proven, but why would you tell your wife that? Obviously, you could say, well, because he got off on those kind of fantasies, but he had such form, didn't he? Look at what he did. The courts did decide to put Ray through 3 separate trials, so that was 1 for each of his surviving victims. Remember, if you haven't got bodies, we have problems, and they can get enough if they put each of those victims on trial against him. Now, officials continued to investigate the case. They were continuing to look for victims. So whilst the first trial for sexual abuse and kidnapping is getting underway in March 2000, how recent is that? This monster had been killing all those years. So whilst that's happening, Parker Ray's got a history of health problems, suffers a heart attack. So ultimately, jurors are unable in the first trial to reach a verdict. I don't know how. It's the way that people think, isn't it, about particularly prostitutes a lot of the time, or that they deserve it. So many biases. Instead of seeing them as a woman, as a victim, so much easier to imagine, no, they were asking for it. These kind of things don't happen to normal women. Anyway, at that point, some of the jury remained unconvinced that the person hadn't consented to the abuse. I mean, genuinely, it's not legal to slap any juror in the face, but arguably it's the way that you feel, isn't it? Because you're like, how can you not see? There are tapes. There are horrific abuse tapes, both video and verbal. There are diaries. There are people admitting that he's murdered people, that they were there, and yet they can't agree. Anyway, fortunately, he's found guilty on all 12 counts following a retrial in 2000. So his next trial is cut short because he agrees a plea deal with prosecutors because he wants his daughter to get off with a more lenient sentence, which is unbelievable. She might have been a victim to some degree at certain points, but she became a perpetrator. I don't believe that she should be out. I don't believe she should be out now. Do you? Jesus, what does that say about our society? That we let some kind of abductor carry on about their business so that he gets a stronger sentence. I wouldn't have accepted it. I'd have just tried him and put him away for life anyway and had her too. He got 223 years. What's so grating and galling about this, though, is in this twist of fate, he dies. He actually manages to escape his richly deserved punishment when he has a massive heart attack in May 2002 that killed him. He's 62 at the time. I know that death is final. I appreciate that death brings closure, that the person can't harm people any longer. But this is a sadomasochist. This is somebody who has raped and tortured and murdered women. He wanted to be in control, and God, he wouldn't have been in control in prison. He would have been at the mercy of other prisoners. He wasn't firm in his health. He would have had a really hard time, and he would have absolutely hated not being in control. And yet he got to escape it. I hope he got a direct flight to hell. After all, he was in the Church of Satan, so we can all imagine that he's royally roasting down there right now. But it kind of frustrates me. So after his death, the infamous Toybox was opened up to the public. Because even though that sounds really macabre, go and admit it, some of you would have visited it, I would have. Can't help it. Can't help it. It's like the sex museum in Amsterdam. Couldn't help it. Just ended up there. Can't help it. If it's dark, I have to go and have a look. So they wanted to do it not because of just the fact that it would invite people to have a look at the heinous crimes that were going on. The idea was that it could provoke memories because of the coverage. No other leads came. And so the investigation essentially came to the end. So many bodies never found. Probably so many street workers, runaways, murdered and just discarded. Because no one was looking. Remember, they drove hours and hours and hours away, so no one was connecting these people. Hundreds of items were found, hundreds, that were trophies. They believed that were belongings of Parker Ray's victims. So they found pieces of jewellery, clothing, mementos, and we know that that's very much the serial killer, isn't it? They like to have pieces of their victims that they can enjoy memento-wise, so it reminds them of what they've done. Now, images of those I'm going to put on because I think it's really important when we talk about these cases to remember that this has been quite recent. You know, he died in 2002. There will be victims of his potentially who are alive. And the more that we spread the word, the more that those mementos will get seen, and there will be family members potentially who get to recognise them. And whilst that might not bring their murdered relative back, it may give them closure to understand why they're not coming back. Also, it could provoke a memory of a victim if they saw something that belonged to them. It's a really important thing to do. Now, to date, nothing's happened, no one's come forward, but we've also got to remember that Parker Ray lived in New Mexico. He had so many opportunities to just go and dump bodies, didn't he? In abandoned land, in reservoirs. The authorities think they'd have got away with doing that without pretty much any witnesses. And what's more, you know, when you've got a choice of drifters, homeless people, you've got prostitutes that you can pick up at your local Blue Water Saloon bar, which is where the police believe he picked up a lot of the victims, he would have the pick of them, wouldn't he? And it seems really that the world will never know. The world will never know the truth about how many women he took, how many were held captive in Parker Ray's toy box, never to be seen again. On reflection, it's likely that Parker Ray was making snuff movies. He apparently already had told authorities that he made money filming the torture of his victims and selling videos online. A snuff video is one where you literally snuff out the life of your victim. You're basically filming their torture and murder, and it may be hard to stomach, but those things are popular. They're more popular now than ever. And people go missing all the time. I think it's really hard for us to get our heads around that. I've worked in sexual exploitation. I've worked with people who've been sex trafficked. So I know the dark world, but I think a lot of us don't want to believe it exists, but it does. The dark web is 95% of the web. And people aren't just getting drugs and selling guns there. And there's a hell of a lot of trafficking that goes on. And there's a huge amount of money to be made from doing the most heinous of things to innocent people. The younger the better often. The fact that he had these elaborate tools, all this money, he had medical grade gear, drugs, that sounds to me like he wasn't a lone wolf. It sounds to me like he had a very good business going. One of his early victims, it seems at least, was an old business partner who's called Billy Bowers. His body was discovered floating in the Elephant Butte Lake by a fisherman. He had a bullet in his head, weighed down by 2 anchors. Now, Cindy would later tell the police that it was after this incident that Parker Ray learned he had to slit the bodies of his victims open, fill them with cement to avoid them floating to the surface. That's also why a lot of people puncture lungs, because obviously the lungs fill up with air. So people will slice the lungs so that when they go in the water, they don't float. I guess this is why a lot of us won't ever find out where his victims' bodies were, because he was very adept at making them into fish food, or ensuring that they were sunk so deep and so heavily that they would never float or be found. After his arrest, Parker Ray agreed to show authorities where he buried loads of his victims, but because his death happened at an untimely level, they're never going to find the secrets of his victims' graves, which is just awful, isn't it? So he really did take those secrets to the grave. Makes me angry, because I don't think I've ever heard of crimes quite as depraved, graphic, overt, enjoyed, displayed, and probably made into a business for many, many, many years as I have in listening to this case. And like I said, what stays with me is he won't be the only one. And when you hear these stories and how recent they were and how technology has advanced, it makes you think about all the other unwitting victims who meet their doom in similar circumstances at the hands of depraved serial rapist killers like this man. I hope that I've given you some insight into this that you might not have known. I hope that you found it an interesting case. I appreciate the graphic nature of this. I will put some links as well to his full recording for those of you who have that macabre interest in listening to the kind of horror that he inflicted on his victims. And thanks for joining me. I'll be back again. As you know, if you've not subscribed already, go on, hit the button. You know you want to. You can get more of this content twice a week. I put quite a lot of effort into it. See you soon.